Oh, hey, I'm glad you're here. If this is your first listen, our original format is each episode is about a film and the guest has the profession or experience portrayed in the film. This is one of our alt formats where we casually chat about things we enjoy before a late return to a film we think should be more widely discussed. Movies, like music, can leave an indelible imprint on the viewer. For many of us, we recall specific times and who we were with when we watch a movie. Whether that be in a theater, watching 1994's Crumb with someone you had a crush on, or at home with friends seeing Valerie in her Week of Wonders, podcasts about movies also have that same opportunity, I think. A mention of something like The Very Eye of Night by Maya Deren can lead to a new audience for an important experimental director. I mean, should you have a viewing of something that's meaningful to you, I hope you'll reach out to this podcast or any podcast, because it's a special feeling to know someone took the time to press play on something they might have passed on, and then also took a moment to let you know. Just this weekend, I was at a craft fair and someone heard my voice and said, "Are you the guy with the movie podcast?" Which, I mean, yeah, I'm the only one, for sure. Because they heard me on someone else's podcast. They heard me on the Dog Zone 9000, which was quite lovely. We had a nice little chat. So it's good to see that even movies with Manborgs can bring people together. Lastly, I wanted to thank our recent Patreon supporters. You can find us on Patreon /VHUS. So thank you to the following people: Robert Brockway, Kaida Zankich, RP Briggs, Pat Finn, Erica Deaton, Rudy, Derek Smith, Root Alpha, A is for Alcoholic, Devry, and Ryan. Thank you so much. Without your support, we couldn't do the show the way we like, which is to hire original art and a talented editor to make this show what it is. Like the time I hired comic artist Layla Del Duca to draw Eric Roberts in The Ambulance, and then hired Eric Roberts to congratulate Layla Del Duca on her Wonder Woman comic, and then cut it into the episode. We like to get weird. Speaking of art, we now have a shop on Threadless. That's right, we're putting all of our original episode art created by Celine Cordero. If you don't know, Celine Cordero does all of our original art. She's the first female hentai artist of New Mexico, some 15 years ago, I believe. She creates beautiful original artwork for us, and it's going to all be available on shirts and soon mugs. So why not start your day off with Carmelita Valdez McCoy, Sarah Marshall, and I as the Crow from the Crow episode. You know you want to. That'll be up soon. We're also adding more designs every couple of days, so thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. Now let's get to the episode. The movie is The Chaser, the guest is Preston, and this is VHS Presents New Releases and Late Returns. Hello, and welcome to VHS Presents New Releases and Late Returns, our casual chat format where we first champion what's bringing us joy from the realms of entertainment before I look back at sometimes a forgotten gem. I'm your host, Dirk Marshall, and you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at VHUS_podcast. I'm also Dirk Marshall on Letterboxd, and I sometimes click on movies there, very rarely. My guest for this episode is Preston Mitchell. Thank you for being here.
Hey, Dirk, it's a pleasure meeting you.
Now, where can people find you?
So you can find me on Twitter at PRESTOMIT or at letterbox.com at PRESTO_MITCH.
Perfect. It's nice to officially meet you. I've been aware of your podcasting guesting, I guess I would say.
Yes. I'm a nomad in the film podcasting scene. I've gotten in the habit of going from one to another, sometimes certain ones multiple times, depending on if the host wants me there. And I'm always glad to be on a podcast. I love movies and talking about them with people almost more so than watching them sometimes. So it's a pleasure.
Yeah, I feel that too. Which brings us to new releases. We'll dive right in and we start with print. Is there anything you're currently reading?
Oh, not at the moment, but I did start Heat 2 actually in the past week, written by Meg Gardner and Michael Mann. I'm a big fan of the movie that it's a literary sequel to. It's interesting so far. I can't say I've been good about actually sitting down with it, but it is on my priorities list to finally dig into, because it's one of those where once I'm sure I get into the thick of it, then it's going to be quite the page turn. My whole afternoon is going to go away.
Yeah, I bet. It's interesting. I've heard about this book. I haven't read it, but I'm interested in checking it out for sure. I have been reading Dying for Living. It's volume 1, supposedly. There's more volumes I haven't seen, but it's by Patrick Kilpatrick. He's an actor. I'll just read part of the back here to kind of put this in perspective better than I could. Patrick Kilpatrick has been killed, beaten up, or jailed by nearly every leading actor on Earth and in outer space. Tom Cruise, Sean Connery, Bruce Willis, Naomi Watts, Steven Seagal, Jean-Claude Van Damme, Chow Yun-fat, Jessica Alba, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and many more. His career as an elite action villain has spanned more than 170 films and TV shows. It's a very good read. Most people probably know Patrick from Class of 1999.
Hmm.
Yeah, he's one of those baddies. He's super awesome. He's really great. And I just wanted to start reading it. And it just happened to be, I picked this up a while ago. Then I got busy. And then I saw it on the shelf when I started organizing the studio for the season. And I was like, oh my gosh, I should dive back into that. So Dying for Living is the book by Patrick Kilpatrick.
I'm writing that down. That sounds totally my jam, especially considering until Film Twitter, I didn't know there was so much literature available about kind of the 80s, 90s action film scene. And I've heard about Class of 99 for years. It's one of those I've been meaning to watch. Now, is that a sequel to, or is that related to the Class of 1984? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's a sequel in
Okay.
theory. Yeah, it's really good. I did an episode on it with, it was either a teacher or a principal. I got to listen to this podcast I host. It's, it's a wonderful movie. It's very entertaining. I highly recommend it. Class of 1999. Which brings us to music. Anything you're currently listening to?
Yes, yes. I definitely think there's a certain band. I believe you addressed them on your podcast before. I just have finally been getting into Bauhaus for the first time.
Oh, nice.
I listened to their albums Mask and In the Flat Field specifically. One of my best friends, he's really big into the goth rock scene. It's what his musical foundation was. Ever since he and I have been reconnecting for
Mhm.
the past several years, he's been passing me music recs, and that was one of the big ones. And when I told him I listened to Mask, he was like, "You gotta listen to In the Flat Field." And
Of
so
course, yeah.
I've been bumping that record nonstop for the past several weeks. It's a great listen.
So I imagine you're there at the gym and you're working out and you're listening to In the Flat Fields. Is that what's happening?
Basically, yeah. I mean,
Nice.
Dark Entries has a cool little beat, of
Yeah.
course, and of course the song Bela Lugosi's Dead is legendary. I'm not sure if that's on the album, but whenever I listen to the album, I
It
end up
beats
just
the
listening
others.
to
Yeah.
other singles of their discography. It's really interesting. It's very, for me, someone who's new to it, and you can probably speak to it more fluently or eloquently, but I'm starting to discover with Gothic music, I really like how they appropriate elements of industrial. They utilize a lot of analog instrumentation to
Mhm.
kind of create a mood.
Mhm.
And I think this actually kind of relates to the movie we're talking about in some ways, but I really find myself gravitating towards fatalism and those kinds of things. And I
Mhm.
think Bauhaus really addresses that.
Yeah. My wife and I saw them play this year, and it was, for one, awesome. And two, live, it really put in perspective for me the amount that they were lifting from dub. And if you listen to the beginning of Bela Lugosi's Dead, or I forget the other song that I had just listened to, but it's so heavily influenced by the dub elements that were happening in reggae. And,
Mm.
partly because Bauhaus was like an art rock band. And then when they
Oh, you
did,
mean like the ska instruments, or not ska, but they kind of sound like
there's
the
there's like an echo on the tinniness of the drums and the slow, like, kind of bouncy bass lines that are sparse.
yep.
If you just look up dub, there's actually a band called Jaw Division, JAH Division, which is, there's two bands, so be careful when you look it up on iTunes, because one of them is just straight up a reggae band, but the other one is dub versions of Joy Division songs. That's why they're called Jaw Division. And so they do Love Will Tear Us Apart, but it's like at half speed. It's really fun, very entertaining, but that's what blew me away, because I knew Bauhaus started as kind of like glam art thing. And then Bela Lugosi's Dead blew up, and everyone was like, "This is goth rock," but like they didn't really start that way. It's fascinating, but yeah, they're different elements. They're really good. I love that. Did you have another one?
Yes, yes. The band Ecstasy.
Wait,
This same friend.
from the '80s?
Yes, yes. I had never heard them before, and
Right.
I know this is completely different, but I had never heard them before. And this same friend, he was like, "Dude, like you gotta listen to Skylarking. It's like one of the best albums." And lately, I've been getting more into Todd Lundgren between his solo stuff and a lot of albums he produced. I believe he produced some stuff for McCartney, Lennon, people along those lines. Definitely Hall and Oates for sure. A lot of
Mhm.
their like deeper cut albums. That's another thing. That's another thing I've been listening to. But specifically, Skylarking, I really like how it's not similar to what we just talked about, but I really like it when music is very, how can I put this, like multi, there's a bit of a eccentricism to it and an eclecticism.
Hmm.
And those are, and they're very weird and they're very quirky. They very much fit into that new wave era of 80s rock while also being a bit more daring than my ear is used to
Hmm.
from that era specifically. So just trying to expand my musical palette with those records, and I'm starting to really get into that.
That's awesome. There was a bunch of compilations in the 90s, early 90s, I'd say, and I'll dig them up. They would come with like a booklet, and so there'd be pages about each band. It was like a thick thing, and then a CD just kind of glued to the back of it. It was real crazy. But all those bands like you're talking about that sound like that are from the 80s, that were like really weird and edgy, but like there's a
Mhm.
purpose to what they're doing. They would all be featured in there, and I learned so much just by reading these compilations. It was called like, this is, you know what? I shouldn't have even started the sentence without. I have like literally thousands of CDs right behind the laptop that I'm like trying to look at the compilation, but I'll put it in the show notes for anyone listening, because you can still find these things really cheap, but they were responsible for exposing me to so many different bands before I worked in music stores.
That's
Okay, I have a
awesome.
couple. So Musique is someone that I listen to a lot. Mike is the guy that does that. His album's called Hello. So MU-ZIQ is the name of it, Musique. So he, for shorthand, it's Aphex Twin. He's like the American that we have doing what Richard was doing over in England, but of course of his own
Mm.
flair. It's like, avant-garde drum and bass. There's like sparse electronics. I've just always listened to him since the 90s, and he just put an album out called Hello, and it sounds exactly like he sounded in the 90s to me. And I love this. Like the Chemical Brothers did the same kind of thing where they put an album out using the old equipment that they used when they first started. So it
Right.
sounds like the old Chemical Brothers, and that's how this sounds to me. Like it just hits me in the same way where like I'm 17, I have my first apartment, like this is what I'm listening to. I don't have a bed, it's just a mattress on the floor, but I'm like I'm living, I'm out there like. And so I love this album, Music, Hello. And then the other one is Cuedo. It's Kuedo. The album's called Infinite Window. And Cuedo's great. They do like very down tempo, sort of strange orchestrated synth stuff, very instrumental. That's a lot of what I listen to right now. As the weather gets colder, I tend to like gravitate towards this, and then into like
Mhm.
really aggressive industrial as it gets into the holidays, where I have to like I really gotta like pack up a lot of sauce and stuff. I need like really aggressive music to keep me going. But this is the opposite of
Mhm.
that. The song I want to highlight is called Harlequin Hallway. It's like when this hit, so I'm listening to the album and it's like these soaring, strange synth lines, and then Harlequin Hallway comes along and it drops a beat that's like so good that like, so when I used to DJ with my friend Aaron, we would make these sick faces when beats would hit in songs, and they're just so good, where you look ill,
The
really.
stank face.
Yeah, and this has it. And then I was like, oh my gosh, this is so good. Listen to it by myself. And then there's a breakdown where there's just synths and stuff. And then the beat comes back even tighter. And I just was like, this is like the best. I just put it on repeat for like an hour and a half because I was just like, this is all I need. But yeah, that's Cueto and Musique. I put them on random together, and it's just a wonderful time. So those are the two that I have, which brings us to games. And I don't know, Preston, do you play any games?
I'm actually not a big gamer,
Not a gamer.
Unfortunately, the last game I did play back when I was sharing a PS4 with some roommates was The Last of Us 2. I was a huge fan of the first one in college and the second one. The second one was there, story wise. I still enjoy the game overall, but the story went directions I wasn't a big fan of.
Mm,
It reminds me of a lot of the discourse you'll find about a lot of tentpole blockbuster films nowadays,
sure.
where typically I usually end up in the middle where I'm like, I like that. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I loved that first game. It freaked me out. It terrified me. I screamed. I was nervous. And then the second one came along and it was more of that. I wasn't too precious about the characters. I was, at the time, there was such a horrible discourse about the female character looking mannish. And there was just like
It was
very,
toxic.
very toxic. I just was so pushed off of any of that. It was trying to experience it. And once that game was over, I was like, I will never play that again. Like, it was so intense at times, and I didn't want to be doing some of the things they were making you do. But like the
Oh
first one, I
yeah.
would replay sections of it over and over again. Like the part where you're coming out of a building and there's like a courtyard. I would sneak around those buildings and kill all those dudes silently,
Yes.
like so many times. Anyway, yeah, that's great. I'm only playing one game, just started it. It's called The Ascent. People
I've
call it
heard of that, I think.
they call it an isometric twin stick shooter, which is so much nerdy language I don't even understand. But basically, it's like a top down perspective, and you're running around in this future city. I am laughably awful at this game, but I have two friends that I was playing with last night, JL and Sean Baby, and they made it so fun. I was having a great time. I was the person getting downed all the time, and I was the person shooting at the wall rather than the killer robots. But whatever, it was fun. And I only really play games as a social thing. It's like my friends and I were all dads, and so our kids
Oh
are in
yeah.
bed, so you're just at home, and it's like, well, I can just talk on the headset to my friends. We just kind of check in about our day while we're doing whatever. The Ascent's pretty fun. I like the soundtrack a lot. It's futuristic, it's robots. The bad dudes are called turbo punks, and I'm like, well, I'll play anything where there's turbo punks, that's for sure.
So is it like a riff on Cyberpunk?
Yeah, it's kind of in a cyberpunkish kind of world. It's kind of like Mass Effect, but nobody recycles. There's just trash everywhere. It's kind of like yeah, futuristic kind of thing like that. It's cheap. It's like on the PS5 it was like $14 or something.
Oh,
Yeah,
nice,
totally worth it.
nice.
Really driving, like synth techno-y thing that kicks in every time you're in battle. Pretty addictive. But yeah, that's the Ascent. Which brings us to television. Anything episodic that you're currently enjoying?
Oh goodness. I actually don't watch a lot of television at the moment. Usually I'll get like one show a year where I am like, okay, I'm all in on this. During the first year of lockdown, for example, that 2020 year, I binge watched the entire series of The Sopranos
Hmm.
because I had never seen it before, and it was totally my jam. I thought the show was brilliant from top to bottom. Lately, not so much. Like usually, if I do wind down, it's usually some comfort shows. Well, I guess this does answer your question. Lately, I have been on and off for the past year. I've been watching the Mary Tyler Moore Show.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, for two reasons. One, so my favorite movie discovery of last year was Broadcast News, which the James L. Brooks movie,
Oh
and
yeah.
I used to watch Mary Tyler Moore a little bit as a kid, but I was never immersed in it. But I knew her from the Dick Van Dyke Show
Of
because
course. Yeah.
my parents were big Dick Van Dyke fans. And so I was like, man, I really need to watch this show because I really love broadcast news. And you can definitely tell the lineage of where Brooks built his movie career from his
Mm.
television upbringing. And best of all, it's just a hilarious show. It's still funny. I love Ed Asner in it. I
Yeah.
love
Oh, Lou.
yeah, yeah, Lou. Rhoda's awesome.
Yeah, Road was
Cloris
great.
Leachman. It's just great classic TV. It's low stakes. As of right now, I love shows like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll throw on old episodes of The Next Generation, the Star Trek, that is,
Mm.
just for kicks, because that's just what my comfort place is.
Yeah, I don't know if we were interacting on Discord or Twitter, but it was either you talking about news or I just made the connection because of Christopher Reeves. Somebody was talking about that, and I was mentioning switching channels. Was it you?
Yes, yes. I talked about that with Lindsay.
Okay, great.
We recorded about Death Trap earlier this year,
Uh,
and she had never heard Switching Channels, and I love that movie so
yeah,
much.
it's so funny. His physical comedy in that is really great, highly underrated.
Very underrated.
Yeah, when he gets in that elevator, oh man, it's so good.
And he's crawling all over the
Yeah,
window, and
and he's so
oh
long
man.
and tall and lanky and just like, yeah, he's great. He's super great. Well, I'm just watching Killer Sally on Netflix. It's a bodybuilder couple. She shot her husband, and that's where we're at. We just started, my wife and I just started it last night. It's one of those things where we don't watch a lot of true crime, but if it's an interesting, compelling story, like they interview her. So she's aware of the story that she's telling. So I know that she's not being taken advantage of. I don't like real life horror as entertainment. You know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
I don't watch Dahmer. I'm on the side of the victims. I don't like this idea of like, anyway, I don't want to get too into that, but
Hmm.
this is fantastically fascinating because they have all this footage of her and her husband, and they're just so jacked. Like every time you see them, you're just like, oh my, like, how is this even possible? And the answer
It's
is
a
steroids. But yeah, I recommend it so far. She's kind of telling the story, and then the children that are now grown up are talking as well. But you see all these competitions, and it's a wild world.
oh man. Is this a docu series?
Yeah, it's a 6 episode thing. Yeah, I think. And I like those too, where it's just like this is how long it is, so you know, like okay, this is what I'm in for. There won't be another season, I don't think. You know, it's just like okay,
Yeah, I love miniseries quite a bit, like because it gives you room to, quite frankly, not suck.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
you can't have a lot of tertiary subplots. You can call the fat essentially.
hmm
And I love what you said about. I know you don't want to get too much into it, but I'm kind of like you in that regard. That's why I kind of, even though the movie we're talking about deals with
right, yeah, yeah,
a serial killer, I think the fabrication of those deeds says something about the human condition. Whereas, like, I try to not escape into real life. Like, I'd rather escape into something that's clearly
same.
heightened. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I like wild, fantastical stuff, but it's all made up. It's all, and I'm not going to memorize serial killer names over the victims.
yeah.
You've built up this notoriety off of doing terrible things to people, and it's like, I'm not a fan. Sorry. Taking a
No,
hard stance that I'm against murder, but
no, I think I understood your brain once I finally watched Hellraiser 2, Hellbound Hellraiser 2 a couple weeks ago. I was like, wow, that is the platonic ideal of where Dirk's coming from. Okay, now I feel like when I listen to your shows and your guest appearances, I'm like, okay, now I get where he's coming from. He
oh,
says
that's
something's
nice.
not as bonkers.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's so interesting to be talking to people who are like, I get you, or like, I see you this way. And I'm like, oh gosh, am I that way? I don't know. Cause like what you're normally into, you're just like, yeah, everyone likes this. And then my wife will be like, no, no, that's not. And I'm like, oh, okay. Okay, interesting. Which brings us to movies. Anything you've watched recently that you'd like to talk about?
Definitely, definitely. My favorite movie discovery of last month, October, was kind of a mix of a genre potpourri. I did watch a lot of classic horror, more on that side of things, but I did make sure to cram in a few things that were already in my wheelhouse already. Like I love westerns, for example. So I watched a movie called One Eye Jacks for the first time. 1961. It's directed and stars Marlon Brando, where essentially he plays in the American West, so presumably the 1800s. He plays a gentleman by the name of Ringo the Kid, and there's a robbery that goes bad, and his cohort slash mentor slash best friend, whose name is literally Dad, played by Carl Malden, basically neglects him. Whenever there comes a point in the beginning of the film, Ringo is caught. He's the one person from the robbery who's caught. Dad looks away and then turns back. And 5 years pass away. Ringo comes back, this vengeful man, so to speak. Like he comes back essentially with hairs on his chest and a chip on his shoulder, trying to kill Dad. And when he goes and finds Dad, what makes this different from majority of other Western revenge stories, and both genres usually can go hand in hand. I don't want to say usually, but they can go hand in hand. Is that when he finally sees the person who clearly and blatantly betrayed him, like we all see with our own eyes, he's like, no, Dad's a sheriff. He visibly has remorse. They can sit down, they have a conversation. And the entire film goes in all these weird directions. It's not a short film, it's a 2.5 hour movie, nearly. And what I think is so special about it is that being Brando's sole directorial effort, you really do get an accentuation of sorts of his method acting prowess, his approach to performances. The performances in this movie are next level, especially for a genre film of its time. It's not a perfect movie. It can get a little baggy at times, but I think if you're the type of person who can give yourself over to a historical film, I think the wonder of the scenery, the action of it, the romantic nature of it, that really spoke to me on a certain level. I think it's just one of the superlative westerns.
Yeah, I forgot I saw this until you started talking about it and started naming the characters because I was shown this in school, like studying movies. The teacher loved this
Oh
movie
wow!
and so showed this. I was just on a podcast talking about how I'm not a huge Western fan, but I
Mhm.
remembered the dad character and the Brando directed it. And I was just like, I haven't thought about that in forever. I should recheck that out. Sometimes I'll come across a movie and not be in the right place for it and then watch it years later and be like, oh, this is great. But at the time, I don't know what was going on with where I was at, but I just wasn't giving the movie like either my full attention or whatever. Sometimes I have to rediscover things later on.
I totally get that. I've gone through that multiple times this year, so I get that. And One Eye Jacks, it's not a pulp film like a lot of westerns are. It's not a particularly fun movie. It's very much a meditation on the nature of revenge and doing so in a way where The character, you know from the get-go what he wants to have, and he's going to stop at nothing to do it. But it's the amount of time and the amount of patience that he takes to get into it that I think deliberately wears down the viewer. It speeds up when it needs to, and then it slows down realistically so. And there's a scene actually, and this is why I think everybody should see this movie, even if they're not a big Western fan. There's a scene in the movie that made me tear up where Katie Hirado she's best known for High Noon, her and her daughter in the film, they have to sit down and talk about the nature of her virginity being taken.
Mm.
And it's all in Spanish, which never happens. Usually Westerns, they pretend like everybody magically speaks English. Yeah, everyone magically speaks English, but it's a beautiful scene where it's not subtitled, it's all in Spanish, but you get the emotion, you get the gist, and both characters cry with each other. And Gerardo comes out of the room, closes the door, looks at Carl Malden, and you know what's about to happen. And it's a big special scene in the film that I think is just so beautiful and elegant and is a great impetus for more tension moving forward. I love One Eye Jacks.
Awesome. Well, much in the same accord, my first one is Suspended Animation from 2001, in which an animator on a snowmobile takes a trip and runs into two cannibal sisters. Yep. So pretty much pretty much what you're saying. It's a quirky snowmobile movie. My wife and I recently watched Chill Factor this October, and then I was like, I wonder how many snowmobile movies are out there. It's just the way my brain works, and so I've been digging, and I found Suspended Animation. Yeah, there's two cannibal sisters and this guy trying not to get eaten by them. It's indie. It's got like a dark comedic, I think it's intentional kind of thing going on. I don't know many people that will dig it, but I thought it was very fascinating, and it has snowmobiles. So Suspended Animation from 2001 is what I'm talking about first. What do you got next?
Oh, well, that one's on my list. It sounds interesting at the very least.
Oh, gosh.
Next up, I took myself to the movies this past weekend to go see The Banshees of Inisherin. Few people who follow me already have heard me talk about this movie, but basically, I love it. I think it's one of the best movie watching experiences I've had this year.
Whoa.
If people don't know what it is, it stars Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson as two best friends. They're on a fictional island in Ireland in the middle of the Irish Civil War. And I think that war ended after the early 20s. But I think this movie takes place in 1923. But basically, they play best friends who every day after about 3 or 4 o'clock, they go to a pub and they drink a pint at least. And that's kind of their day with each other. And then all of a sudden, one day, Brendan Gleeson's just like, yeah, I don't want to see you anymore. Don't talk to me. And Colin Farrell has the hardest time dealing with that breakup. And what you get is a breakup film that is very much about the malaise of boredom and depression and how much self-destruction hurts the people around you and the people close to you. And the performances and the writing are so good. It's from the Martin McDonagh, who's best known as the filmmaker behind In Bruges, which also stars the two aforementioned leads. And it's kind of
a sequel.
Before I went in, because I didn't really watch too many trailers, but I really feel like McDonagh was really extending on a few of the themes of In Bruges without repeating himself, while also going back to his own roots. I believe he's British, not Irish, but I do believe that he has lineage that tracked back to Ireland, because this movie, it felt way more personal and way more raw than his previous film did to me. And it's basically a hilarious comedy until it's not, much like In Bruges. And I think if you're a fan of dramas that approach sadness without being a chore, it's very breezy despite being a film about boredom. So I think if you are a fan of dramas, I think it's well worth watching.
Okay, great. Well, much in the same vein of what you're talking about, I watched Hell Trap from 1989. It follows two rivaling groups of friends intending to hunt a bear in the forest, but soon they're stalked by a masked madman who's a Vietnam veteran. It's directed by Pedro Galling III, who also did Vacations of Terror 2 and Cobra Gang. It's a Spanish film. It's mostly notable because of the mask the guy wears. It's like very strange, very mannequin-y, weird hair. I just found out about this director, so I was just kind of going through all the things that he made. It's hard to see, so maybe, who knows? The way it usually works is I mention this, and then a Blu-ray comes out. So once I get it down, and spent the money. But yeah, if you're into those kind of movies where people are wandering around in a forest and they're getting picked off one by one, check out Hell Trap from 1989. Do you have anything else?
There's one more. This month, we're recording in November, and it's, I guess, if you're in the Twitter scene, you'll know of Noirvember, where a bunch of us, like old movie fans, will be watching old noir movies from the old Hollywood days, or in the case of something like Stray Dog, the Kurosawa movie, like other countries as
Yes.
well. I saw one for the first time that I really enjoyed called The Strange Love of Martha Ivers. I don't know how too many people would take to it for a number of reasons. One, it's a Barbara Stanwyck movie. It stars her, Van Heflin, who's probably best known to many as the Christian Bale in 3:10 Yuma, the original film. He's also in Shane as well. And then a movie also stars Kirk Douglas and Elizabeth Scott, who I'm kind of becoming a bigger fan of from the couple movies I've seen of hers this year. But basically, it follows Stanwyck's character from when she's a little girl. She ends up killing her aunt and as a kid, and basically her kind of, I'm trying to remember the detail, but kind of her father figure in the movie, who's not related to the aunt that died, basically gets her to cover it up. And then there's a whole labyrinthine story behind that you find out later on. And she ends up marrying the only other person who saw the murder, who was Kirk Douglas as a kid. So she's kind of in this marriage with this guy who owns all of the city politically.
Hmm.
And then Van Heflin comes to the picture in a big way. And what resonated with me about it is that Van Heflin, in general, I'm used to seeing him in old movies as kind of like what everybody thinks, everyone imagines like Jimmy Stewart being, or until they actually see more Jimmy Stewart movies, or someone like a Glenn Ford without seeing Glenn Ford movies, where you think he's going to be vanilla, he's going to be passive and taciturn. And Van Heflin's kind of a badass in the movie. He walks into the small town with like a bunch of people knowing his criminal past, and he's like hitting people over the head with like glass bottles and throwing around throwing around tables and stuff like that. And he really commands the room in a way I've never quite seen before. And also, the movie is, it's not a standard Barbara Stanwyck vehicle because she's not at the fore. It's much more of Elizabeth Scott, Van Heflin show, a part of an ensemble. So the Stanwyck parts are great. I think the movie itself is very good. I think the ending is honestly amazing. It's just a really fun, twisty ride that even if it doesn't connect with you, I think it still takes some turns with the genre that you don't quite see.
Interesting. What was that again?
The Strange Love of Martha Ivers.
Okay, perfect. I haven't heard of that at all. My last one is Vacations of Terror 2 from 1991. It's the same director as Hell's Trap. Again, very difficult to find. The first Vacations of Terror, if you're like, we didn't hear about the first one, it's a haunted house doll movie where no one dies, but it's really weird. Very bizarre movie. In the second one, the doll's back and it's porcelain, but sometimes it's cloth. And at one point, it rips open and it's a giant lizard man. And I don't need to tell listeners that that's all it takes for me to watch a movie. But if you look up Vacations of Terror 2, if you just Google it, you'll see the lizard man's face. And it's enough to make me hunt something down. And it was very hard to find, but it's a weird oddity. So I'm sorry that you're on talking about all these wonderful wonderful films, and I'm like, I dug up some weird stuff, but that's where I'm at this week when we recorded, so I gotta be honest.
No apologies, no apologies. I was gonna say, which one came out first, Vacation of Terrors or Hell Trap?
Oh, Hell's Trap's 1989 and this is 1991, so yeah, I think you went Hell's Trap, then Vacations of Terror, and then Vacations of Terror 2. I think Cobra Gang was before all of those, but that's a director I've never heard mentioned. So anyway, I've watched his movies, which brings us to Late Returns. And this isn't so much a forgotten gem, but through our conversation, we were kind of deciding what we were going to do for this episode. And I think you mentioned you weren't super well versed in Korean thrillers. And so I asked if you knew Na Hong Jin's work, and you said you hadn't seen some of it. And I was like, great, let's start with his first feature, The Chaser. Feeding. Everyone's got to do it, even vampires. But if you aren't a vampire, or a baby vampire, then sometimes eating can become so repetitive and boring. Which is where Marshall's Hot Sauce comes in. Liven up any meal with those small batch sauces made from only the freshest ingredients. From the sweet, mild heat of smoked habanero barbecue to the addictive serrano ginger lemongrass, or even my two personal favorites, habanero carrot curry and bird's eye basil. In fact, Marshall's Hot Sauce even has a new line of seasonings, including an incredible barbecue rub, a chicken marinade, and even a volcano sparkle that a vampire could eat. The best part is that you can enter VHS Podcast at checkout for 20% off. That's right, liven up those meals and wake up those undead taste buds at marshallshotsauce.com. That's Marshall's, HAUTE sauce.com, and enter VHS Podcast for 20% off. And now, back to the show. So we're talking about The Chaser today from 2008. It's directed by Na Hong Jin, who did The Chaser, The Yellow Sea, and The Wailing. It stars Kim Yoon-suk, who's also in The Yellow Sea, and Ha Jong-woo from The Yellow Sea, The Handmaiden, and Assassination. Synopsis is a disgraced ex-policeman who runs a small ring of prostitutes finds himself in a race against time when one of his girls goes missing. I'm so glad that we're talking about this movie, basically because you just showed your pedigree for speaking about films and some very well-crafted films. And I feel like this film is extremely, well, I don't want to show my cards. Let's just open it up to you, sir. What is your feelings on The Chaser?
Oh, goodness. I've seen a few South Korean thrillers. The movie this reminded me probably the most of, from my experience, is probably Bong Joon-ho's Memories of Murder.
Yeah.
It's not a true crime story, but it's very disturbing in a way that completely clicked with me. So this movie was so my jam. It was so my thing. I think the thing I like most about this film and what I like about these types of South Korean revenge thrillers is that it mixes genres at points. It has bits of comedy, it has bits of horror, but it's neither. It's its own genre, I feel like. I'm curious how much of that comes from the way that the South Korean culture deals with a lot of their situations, because it's clear to me, watching a lot more South Korean films these past several years, pretty much since college. Like, I feel like Old Boy and the whole Vengeance trilogy from Park Chan-wook, that opened up a third eye, if you will, in my giant forehead as to what film could be and achieve. But with The Chaser specifically, what I really like about what this director does is he puts you in this dreamy atmosphere. The movie begins with a montage of a lot of some sunny skies, but then it gets really nighttime really quickly. And it's shot at points almost documentary style. So when the camera is just sitting on characters interacting, you both get into the minutia and sometimes the random idiocies of what average people do, while also you forget at points that you're watching a real movie. And I feel like that's what makes the terror at points that much scary. But that's my overall first impression of the film. I do have a multitude of questions that I'm sure you're willing to chew on, both about this filmmaker, about the film's events. But I was super thrilled. This is one of the coolest noirs I've seen in a while.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to go down this with you, because people that know film noir and stuff, when you see things that have elements of it, it's very exciting, I think, whether it's just a lighting element or something, because you're like, oh my gosh, this is something that started at a very certain time, and now it's being picked back up in this movie in 2008. And yeah, I love the mixture of genre in this. Like, some people call it suspense, some people say thriller, some people throw horror in there, some people say crime. It's really interesting, and how nobody's really innocent in it except for like the child, and the way that he keeps sort of manipulating that. It's like he has all these components and they're like marbles in his hand, and he's just rolling them around, and every once in a while one of them catches a glint of light and you're like, oh, okay, and then it turns again and you're like, oh yeah, but because it's like you're rooting for someone who is essentially like a pimp who has forced these women to be prostitutes, and yet he's the person looking for them more than the police or the detective or whatever, because they don't know that at first that she's even missing. And the turns that it takes. And first of all, that I will say to anyone listening that hasn't seen it, hopefully you'll watch the film before this conversation goes on, because we will mention things, but I won't be going beat for beat through it because it's kind of a bummer. So I don't want to bum people out, but the movie picks up with it really comes to life. But there are parts in it where you're just like, wow, this feels bad. I feel bad right now. And when it goes horror in the brief moments, which are kind of more towards the beginning of the film, it doesn't pull punches. And that's true. And I think a lot of the Korean films and Asian cinema that falls into this kind of weird ambivalent categories is that if they're going to go dark, they go dark. I mean, I Saw the Devil, that movie started at a place where I was like, that's where we're starting? I don't know if I'm going to make it to the end. Are you kidding me? Okay, first, I want to talk to you about a very specific thing in films, and I want to hear your thoughts on the structure of this movie.
Sure, sure. I think the structure is very interesting.
Yes.
And I think the structure of South Korean genre film specifically is very interesting. So for starters, I will say I think the movie, for a lot of taste, not mine, because as you probably guessed, I'm a fiend for film noir. It's my catnip. I
Yeah.
love it so much. I do think the movie is going to run long for a lot of people. And I did what you probably shouldn't do when you find a new gem, where I went on Letterboxd and I was like, what do people I follow feel
Oh
about this movie?
no.
I didn't find anything super negative, thankfully.
Okay.
But what I did see from the few reviews I read of people I follow were that it's long.
Hmm.
And I, for some reason, in a movie called The Chaser, where it's a very atypical chase movie, but I still think it's a chase film. I think that's the one genre classifier that everyone can agree on,
Hmm.
where the movie begins what you would think of as an I Saw the Devil or as a crime procedural from this movement, where they establish up front through several clues that the pimp was a detective and that you can. I'm curious what you think about this, but I feel like the movie makes it to where the audience can fill in the blanks of why he possibly let himself go or he was let go. It's very clear that he's a cynical guy and he sees what I get from this character, who I think is despicable from
Yeah.
the get go.
Yeah.
He's not a good guy, but he's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
He kind of begins the film one of my favorite archetypes in film noir, which is kind of the I call it the touch of evil effect, where there's generally two types of detective stories. You get the Maltese Falcon, which is very, I don't want to call it standard because I love the Maltese Falcon, but it's what you think of as a platonic ideal classic detective story. Bogart is awesome. He's a badass.
Mm-hmm.
Even though he's sleeping with his partner's wife. Once his partner dies, his loyalty kicks in. He uses his charisma and smarts to figure out what's going on. Then get into the touch of evil side, which I most often find more interesting, where touch of evil, the Orson Welles version of the Orson Welles character in that film is kind of the opposite of Charlton Heston in the film, where Orson Welles used to be the vanilla, I talk like Ben-Hur type of detective, and then life happened to him and he gained weight. He became grizzled and a little slobby, but he became more shady in the ways that he deals with himself and criminal activity. And that's very much this guy, but this guy isn't giving himself the chance yet to be on that train. He pimps. There's a line of dialogue that I thought was so interesting where I believe it's with the character Mi Jin. She's used as kind of the MacGuffin of the movie in a lot of ways, where he's like, man, where are these two prostitutes at? I've been calling their phones. All these prostitutes do is just take your money and leave. And then she's like, dude, fuck you. And she's entitled to that. She's not incorrect. It's like, dude, you really see yourself as this angel. Like, look at what you're doing. And I think it's cool that the movie throws you into that characterization and it does so really well. And so when that happened, I was like, this isn't the typical South Korean revenge thriller. And then also too, like the end of Act One is them catching the killer. Like it's them catching the guy. I think his name is Yong Min. Excuse me if I butcher pronunciations, Dirk. I'm sorry. And then when they catch him, they end up interrogating him, and the interrogation scenes are all super interesting.
Yes.
And honestly terrifying in their own right because they're so matter of fact. And I think that plays into a theme that I'm sure is going to come up multiple times throughout our discussion. But it's like the movie is twisting its structure while surprising you as well, to reiterate that evil is just at your doorstep. That evil can literally look like you or me. Not to say you're evil, Dirk, but I am. But no, I'm kidding.
I'm sure everyone will listen to us just laughing and be like, how evil those two are. I really love the structure of this movie. I think it's fascinating. I think this is a great film. It's incredible that this was his first feature. What he does with the structure, where so the serial killer is apprehended, and then it's this whole thing about where is this lady? We got to find the lady, because there's two things they were looking for. They're looking for the killer guy and they're looking for the lady. And we don't know if she's alive. And anytime it cuts back to where she's at, it's just a grim reminder that you're like, this kid now doesn't have a mom. With 20 minutes left, you're like, what's going to happen in this thing? And then he's released from the jail or from the police place. I call it a police place. And, and the lady escapes. And what brings them together, I was just like, you evil, evil person. Like, how can you? And then that all happens, and the movie's not over. So you're like, what is the ultimate end of when are you going to let go of me? It's like a cat toying
Yeah.
with a mouse or something. And where it lands, I was just like, okay, that was really great. You got me. You had me on edge the whole time. All of these weird twists and turns that we were going on. I mean, he has characters meeting each other when they don't know who each other, is. Like, for instance,
Yeah.
when the pimp guy is talking to the killer in the car and he calls the cell phone and it rings, it's just like he has all these great beats in the movie that I was just like, damn it, this
And
is
it's one of the best lines of the movie where the pimp is like, "Oh, that's your phone? Oh, you're fucked, dude."
yeah,
It's a great moment of comedy that can catch your breath, and then all of a sudden the guy just gets out the other side of the car and starts running, and
yes,
then this is the chaser,
yeah,
and every foot chase in this movie, Dirk. Oh my goodness!
yeah,
Like again, the fact that it's Nas' directorial debut is phenomenal because the way he's filming these foot chases they feel decidedly American. I
mm-hmm.
think in the way he's shooting them. This movie took me back to it. This movie was kind of my introduction to South Korean cinema in general. It wasn't Old Boy. It was in high school when I saw The Man from Nowhere.
Oh yes,
This movie reminded me of that, not in terms of content or
mm-hmm.
vibe, but in terms of, whoa, this movie feels very modern. It feels very contemporary, but it feels very Hollywood and how there's no fat to it.
Mm-hmm.
The action is executed in a very, it just has a very Western sensibility to it. And I feel like with this film, I don't want to classify it as an action film, but the action in this film,
Yeah.
in this really twisty turning film, especially the second chase scene where him and his sidekick, they have to split up. He's like, okay, you go that way.
Roommate guy, the guy that was
there we go.
Prison. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that scene is amazing. The way the framing is on the scene before that, where he's looking around, he sees all of the Catholic symbols.
Yes.
That was very interesting to me because, for one thing, for some reason, I never really pay attention to religious symbolism in foreign language film, and I appreciate that this movie highlight that and used it as a motif, and also as a bit of a quiet respite in the middle before the action scene happened, and which is why when it comes back later on, which is how he finds Yan Ming towards the end again, I really like how that's recontextualized as something that's very normalized. Because where you're talking about, that happens, the killer is talking to the shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper is describing the killer and does not know that the killer is standing right in front. And so this is where, like, I got up out of my chair, Dirk, and I paused the movie and I had to catch my breath for a second. And it's funny because I took a little like Twitter break, not to say the movie wasn't engaging me, but I was like, let me just laugh for a minute. I need to breathe for a second. And I saw your tweet where you were like, when I invite nice people to my podcast, I get them to watch the most distressing films. And I was like, okay, that gave me a good hearty laugh. And then when I sat down and then I go and the guy not only beheads the lady, but he kills the shopkeeper and then kills a dog. I was like, whoa. It's like every scene that this guy is in, the killer that is, he gets more and more vile. And that's what makes the movie so frustrating, is like you really want this guy to face his comeuppance. Yeah. But there's also a hint of sympathy throughout, which is interesting. I'm curious to know how you feel about the scene where the killer is let out of jail, the police place, as you put it.
Police place, that's what we
the police place. And he's in the car, and then the guy pulls up his cap and he sees that he's been beat by the pimp in that amazing scene earlier in the movie. And then he looks at the police chief, I'm assuming, and he's like, dude, what the hell, man? And all he can do is just stare down. And it is a serial killer thriller, but it's also kind of a critique of law enforcement and the media, which I'm starting to piece together from watching these films from this country of origin, that they must be as critical, if not more so, of their law enforcement and their class structure as much as we tend to be in the States. So I'm curious, is this something that this director deals with quite a bit, Dirk, or is this inextricable to this movie?
No, I think you're totally picking up on something that is very, very prevalent. One of the things I love about watching films not from the States is that we're all just kind of in the same boat in a lot of ways. And if something terrible happens, there's just limitations for law enforcement. We used to live next to a house that was like a meth lab, and there was crazy people up at all hours. It was really terrifying. And the cops just couldn't do anything. It was basically like, just wait until they assault you or something, and then they can
Oh,
do something. But there's nothing, it's not like the movies where like, Mel Gibson is going to run up and smack the drug dealer or whatever. Like, that's not the world we really live in. And so people are frustrated, rightfully so. And so these movies, I think what he likes to play a lot with is like, who's really making a difference, and does that make them a good or a bad person? And I think in this movie, he makes the pimp kind of the person we're rooting for certain
yeah.
parts of the film, and in doing so you're kind of like, wait, he's, and that's part of that whole like nobody's all 100% good. There's cops that are letting him beat up this killer to get a confession because they know that they can't do it, but they're letting him do it, and it's like, well, then they're also bad, but you're like, but he's worse. And it's like the way that he's twisting and shifting these kind of things, I think as societies we do that a lot.
If you allow me to interject really quick, what I
Yeah.
was going to say about the police enforcement in that regard is the moment I realized I was in for a bit of a bumpy ride in the pimp's chase of the lady is the scene where they finally have the killer in their hands. This is the end of Act One, like I said, and the pimp walks out with a cigarette. This is after he's been interrogated and stuff, and he finally is like, okay, let me go get my client. Let me find out where she is. Let me like follow these clues and that kind of thing. And they cut back to the police station. They cut back to this weird, this weirdly discordant but darkly funny conversation where all the cops in front of the killer are just staring at him,
Yeah.
and they're like, "Okay, so who's going to interrogate him first? Oh, I'll do it. Okay, let me take credit for this." And it's just the repartee. It adds to the disgust, but it's also really funny. And so I think the way that this filmmaker uses comedy but uses truth, because
Mhm.
I think truth and real comedy go hand in hand. And when I say real comedy, I mean not just slapstick without much skill behind it. I mean verbal humor, like quick cutting and pacing. The movie employs a lot of that stuff, and so I'm assuming, as uncut gems like as this is at points, I'm assuming that he must be a pleasure to listen to, at least in terms of interviews, and a pleasure to work with.
Just look at the sequences that happen. So the pimp goes to the apartment of the woman that's missing and runs into the daughter who's just there by herself. And then you kind of have this like Leon the professional situation going on with this pimp and this girl whose mother he essentially sent to a serial killer's house. And yet they're having like his cigarette goes out the window and goes into the back seat. And then she goes back there to get it and throw it out for him so it doesn't burn the
Yeah.
thing. He's constantly swearing around her and then looking at her, realizing that she's there. Like there's these funny ways of like being like, oh yeah, remember there's also a child here. And the way that he's doing that in this film is it's funny, but also you at the same time are like, oh, that's right, her mom's probably dead. Like it's just like it just
Yeah.
fascinates me how he's shifting the tones of everything. And one thing I wanted to open up for us to discuss is his use of a soundtrack. Like the use of music in this movie
Mm.
reminds me a lot of Birdman in a way, in its percussive sort of drive for like chase sequences and stuff, but also the complete absence in realism, like you said, where it's like you're just sitting and watching people connect and you're like uncomfortable and there's no hand holding, there's no string sounds, there's no, it's just, it's very fascinating.
I completely agree. I wasn't thinking of a Birdman comparison, but I think that's really spot on, Dirk, because there is quite a bit of percussiveness during the chase scenes. I feel like the chase scenes, in a way, are another form of relief because even though you're tense, you're getting some thrill because it's a thriller that's not exactly enthralling. And I think
Right.
that's an important distinction to make. This isn't like an old boy. This isn't like one of the earlier Park Chan Wook films. This is much like in the tradition of The Handmaiden, which I think one of the actors you allude to
Yeah.
is in
Yep.
that. Where regarding the use of music, that's something that I don't think I noticed while watching it. Remembering key scenes in my head, like the first scene where he being the killer, it's the first time he has the little girl's mother in his bathroom.
The worst.
It's such a hard scene. Now, this is one of my first questions was, sorry people, but when he nails, is he nailing the neck? Is he nailing the ear? I was a little bit confused as to where the way it was cut was a little confusing to
Oh,
me.
he misses her.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
okay,
so he
okay.
has the chisel that he's going to hit her in the head with, and he slips and hits the tile, which is how she eventually gets the tile to cut the ropes that she's bound with. Those are the two places where he hit the tiles and broke it. It's so brilliant the way he brings it back at the end. But yeah, there's no nail whatsoever. It's also super messed up that when the pimp goes to see the killer's sister, and they have a child that has a scalp wound, and they say it's basically from him, it's from the killer, and hit their
Mhm.
child in the head. I was just like,
That's his nephew, I think they
his
said.
nephew. Yeah, yeah. I was like, is this the darkest thing? Is this feels the darkest I've felt in a while? Which is when I tweeted that I felt so bad because I've heard you talk on podcasts and we'd never met, and I'm like, this guy just sounds like one of the most lovely people, and he's so well spoken on films. And then I was like, this is what I subject him to. This is what him and Dirk like. Oh my gosh. Because I just thought I remember the film noir parts, and I was just like, "This will be perfect, perfect guest." And then it gets into like prostitutes and murder, and I was like, "Damn it! Oh well."
We've got to have a Venn diagram going, Dirk. We've got to
Right?
have your sensibilities and mine, and
Yeah. Don't
and
wait.
and
My sensibilities.
like, don't put that evil on me, Ricky Bobby.
Oh man! Damn it! All right. The next thing I wanted to talk about was well, I guess we already talked about the tone.
Well, you talked about what he did to the nephew. I think it's important to note just really quick, like he
Yeah.
lobotomizes his nephew, like,
Yeah.
and that's what's to me scary about that scene is that you see the cut and then it's a POV shot
Mhm.
where you see the entire cut through his hair.
Yeah.
It's a little child, and it's a very hard to watch moment. And the juxtaposition between that moment and the rest of the moments with the child in the pimp's car, and while she's kind of being his foil in a way, as he's playing the role of investigator, she's through her silence, she's like bouncing off a bit of a conscience to him. I think it's a reminder to the audience that innocence is in this world,
Hmm.
which is why there's a very tenuous relief at the end, if you can even call it that.
So, are you talking about the scene where she's eating noodles?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So that part, I feel like this is a very dark movie. It deals with very dark subject matters, but I think it has a great like propulsion to it in parts, and I think it's very well constructed in a very unique way. But the way that it ends, I felt like this filmmaker was saying that there's hope in the world, and the fact that there could be some good in this person that is so bad. And I think there's something very fascinating in these times where people are very quick to draw lines and be like, which side do you vote on or whatever, like, how do you feel about
Mhm.
abortion or whatever it is, really quickly to write people's entire existences off when it's just like, well, maybe people can sometimes just have a different opinion. And in this,
Yeah.
he's saying like, this person is tragically flawed and has done irreparable damage to people's lives. But even then, in that moment, someone's capable of kindness. And I was like, is this a hopeful movie? Like, it's just, I think that there's something there, and I don't know if it's for everyone, if it's just something that was hitting me, but I think there's something really fascinating about where this movie lands.
And I think what you're talking about is why I really gravitate to noir films. I feel like I constantly, especially around this time of year because of the fall vibes, I feel like people kind of have their jam during this time of year. Like a lot of people, of course, like most people, I probably watch horror films during this time of year. And noir is very niche, but when you find people who connect with it, like it seems like you do, and a lot of the people who we're in the chat with and have
Hmm.
podcasted with do as well to varying degrees probably. I feel like it can offer that little part of coziness after all of this fatalistic nihilism,
Yeah,
if you will.
yeah.
Because what I've always loved about noir is that it's a reminder of how dark life gets, but there's always that reaffirmation of some kind that there can be hope, even if the hope is undercut by more dread.
Hmm.
I think that's a very realistic way of delivering a bit of positivity. I think people forget that It's a Wonderful Life, for example, is an incredibly dark film. And we see that as Frank Capra's opus, the person who is often criticized today for making Capricorn. And that's just one example I can pull from.
Yeah.
But, like there's a journey that George Bailey goes through in that film, a very hard one to watch at points. And the chaser, I'm not going to say this filmmaker is Capra-esque in his sensibility. He's definitely more abrasive, I'll say that, with his content.
Yeah.
But I really feel like the ambiguity of the ending, considering what precedes that, the really tense, fight scene between the pimp and the killer,
Hmm.
and the fact that he almost kills the killer finally. It's like, okay, I'm rooting for a pimp of all people
Yeah.
to kill this guy. Like, I feel I'm digging in within myself to release this evil, to end what I think is the ultimate evil, because I rarely have seen a villain this violent a film. And the fact that it's in such a realistic, non-heightened movie, quasi fantasy, if you will,
Mm.
it makes his deeds so despicable because they are at home. Like this guy is in your backyard, and that backyard may have 9 bodies, as they allude to, or 12, as they say in that interrogation scene. And I feel like I'm all over the place.
No,
My
and
bad.
I wanted to piggyback on what you were saying about the killer, because also I think what's really interesting and terrifying about him is that he's not Hannibal Lecter. He's not this charismatic. They don't
Mm,
give him cool lines and swagger. And when he attempts to even have it, he's immediately shut down by people. He's just so disconnected from life. And that is utterly terrifying that he can just, when he's in the shop, his movements and the nuances of his performance in a hat and sunglasses, when you realize she says that the girl is in the back of the shop and he knows how long it's going to take for the cops to get there, and he asks if she has a weapon and she hands him a hammer, and us as the audience were like, oh no, like it's just
yeah.
like, but his performance is so good in that it's just like so minimal. So we're not spellbound by him at any point. There's no Anthony Hopkins or Perkins even moment where we're just like, this guy's cool. Wait, do I like the killer? We're almost always just like, this is disgusting. This person is terrible. Like it's another fascinating thing that he chooses to do in the telling of this story.
And I think to your point, I think that deliberately makes you hate him more. In a way, it also continues to make the protagonist more interesting. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like with this pimp character, I feel like what works about him is that he is so aggressive that he believes his own bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
When he goes and gets what ends up being the victim, when he goes and gets her from that very weird camera operator and his friend when they're about
Yes.
to set up,
Yeah.
she walks in expecting to just give this guy sex, and she goes to the restroom and then opens the door behind her, and boom, there's a camera operator there. And the guy in bed has this expectation, hey, I know this was a surprise, but I'm gonna film you.
Mm-hmm.
And so the pimp immediately interjects. And this is the moment where I found myself starting to side with him at the
Right.
beginning of the
Yeah.
movie, where he's doing, in a way, I mean, the interest is complicated, it's
Exactly.
compromised because it's
Yep.
for his business, but he's getting her out of the situation that's potentially dangerous for her because she's dealing with creepy men who she doesn't know. And in contrast to the pimp, who, even though the pimp is a scuzzbag, he at least, we haven't seen him touch her in that manner.
Right.
So I think that adds a lot of complexity just to that character trait in and of itself. And I think compared to the killer, that lack of, I'm just going to say it, that kind of sexiness less performance
Mm-hmm.
that you rarely get in genre movies because so many movies are afraid to be realistic, especially nowadays, in a way that's meaningful, excuse me, in a way that sticks with you. There's lots of realistic movies. But the thing about this killer is that the only time he trips in that police station ever, the only time is when the person in the locked room, I believe it's a police psychologist, is
Oh
like, "Oh,
yeah.
you're impotent. Like
Mm-hmm.
the chisel is your penis."
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, "So how long have you been impotent?" And the moment he keeps driving that
Yeah.
like a chisel, like a phallic image, so to speak, that's when he rises up and he does what the pimp does. He rages out, he lashes out, he becomes that noir, that hard edge, like kind of noir protagonist who typically only saves that for the villain. And it's an interesting dichotomy when you look at the movie from both characters' perspective.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great scene too, because it's the only time his pulse really gets racing, aside from like the chase scenes. But as far as acting goes, it's like the rest of the time he's barely paying attention to what people are saying. And then there's an interesting scene though where he's in the police place with the female cop, and she's like typing on her computer, and he's like getting close to her and like moving kind of around chair to chair. And I was like, is he going to kill her? But no, he's not the type of killer in a movie where he's going to grab a stapler and like make a knife out of it, or like that's just she like insults him and he moves back to a different chair. It's just everything in this movie. I'm like, why is this here? There's reasons behind it all. I don't think there's fat to trim off this movie at all, but I think it's fascinating when you start to look at the unique structure. Why are we getting this at this moment? Because it's.
Yeah.
Why are they, when they have to go and they're digging or they're looking in the trees, it's like there's so many interesting twists and deviations this makes from a regular thriller that I'm like, I'm glad that we're talking about it because it made me rewatch this, and then I rewatched The Yellow Sea last night, and tonight I'm probably going to watch The Wailing again. So
I was definitely gonna watch the LC too because I'm like, it's very easy to become a fan of this director because he
yes.
only he only has 3 films and a lot of space in between
Mm-hmm.
their release dates. I'm curious how you feel about that, and do you think that makes for Considering you're likely a fan of his because you were very quick to recommend his films to me, I'm curious, do you think the amount of space between films adds to the quality and adds to the how special they are? And then also, is he the type of filmmaker who changes his style with each movie, or does he typically you're shaking your head like no. So he just fucked up the whole time.
I'm really excited for you to see The Yellow Sea because it is very different than this. It's not as dark, I don't think, at all, but it's really well made. I think he makes really well crafted films. And even The Wailing, the first time I watched it, I was like, I don't know what this is. I was bouncing off of it. And then I watched it a second time and was like, oh, I get it. I get what he's doing. And that one I'm really excited for you to watch. The Wailing. I think it's on, might be on Netflix right now.
It is.
It is. Okay, great. Because it's like a procedural, but then where it deviates is really fascinating. And that he's got a great eye. I mean, The Yellow Sea has the same two leads in it. So you already know you're in good hands acting wise, but in The Wailing, he picks some other wonderful actors. And there's just filmmakers that I don't hear celebrated here as much. And it's usually because they're from overseas. And so anytime that you can bring up a film that you're like, this guy is doing great work. And it's just unfortunate that, like, unless he comes over here and makes it with Travolta or something, it's just not going to get, celebrated in the States. And it constantly irritates me that people don't watch more. Even when like Parasite won, I was like, oh, so for 2 weeks, people will watch movies from Korea, basically, is what's going to happen. It's like
It became a fad.
Yeah, it's sad.
Yeah, no, it's really sad. International film has always been treated that way from Americans, that is. And it's very unfortunate because I was thinking about that too. I was like, what's the difference between non Hongjin and the difference between where Kim Ji Woon, Park Chan Wook, and Bong is that those guys have all crossed over at some point or another, sometimes multiple times. It's interesting this came out in 2008 because I was doing research and it was the third highest grossing movie, I think, that year in South Korea. And the first one was The Good, the Bad, and the Weird, which is actually my introduction to Kim Ji Woon. Awesome, awesome movie. Awesome movie. And I forget, did Kim Ji Woon ever cross over, or am I thinking? Oh, excuse me, The Last Stand. That was his big U.S. movie. Okay, so yeah, all three of those guys have crossed over, and I respect this guy doesn't seem too keen to do that because he seems like he likes to go at his own pace, both career-wise and also movie-wise. Because just with this movie, even though I think it's tense, I think it's edge of your seat thriller goodness. I like how this guy will have little bits of minutia in between all of the thriller goodness, I guess. But, little scenes like what you talked about where the killer is talking to the lady in the police station. It's just, it feels like such a random scene where he's like, oh, your eyes are so pretty.
Right.
And she's literally telling him, dude, fuck off. Like, please stop talking to me. And he skirts back the chair. And it's so unsettling because we actually hear stories and in some cases have known people like that. In a way, it makes his villainy much more palpable because the menace is just there. Like, it's always present. It's not demons. It's not ghosts. It's not that type of horror. The horror feels the closest that a movie can be to a Michael Myers film without being the pulp that permeates majority of that franchise. But the idealism is there, is what I'm trying to allude to.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I feel like I could talk about The Chaser for so long, but we should probably get to final thoughts. Anything we didn't get to that you wanted to put out there before we wrap it up?
Sure. My one question for you is, whenever the little girl, Unji, I think is her name, she kind of goes towards the woman, I believe in her mind, she looks like her mother. And then there's that accident that puts her in the hospital. Like, what? Did she fall over or did someone do something weird with her? I was kind of scratching my head at that part. But that was the one part that, in a movie this dense, I was like, I don't know what that scene means.
Yeah, I don't know. There's food all over the ground and she's laying down and she got hit by something, but I don't know what. I have no clue. Yeah, I don't know what that part is.
That's something I'm going to research. I'm a sleuth when it comes to sleuth movies, I guess. My final thoughts, first off, Dirk, thank you for putting this movie into my life. And this filmmaker, he sounds like he's super fascinating and super innovative and is very much about his own vision. Something I don't think I probably talked about enough was just how uncompromising this movie is, not just in terms of its content and the adulteration of it, but in terms of how little the movie is talking down to you. It assumes that it's going to be for something of a smart audience, and I think it honors that by giving you complex characters, like basically being firmly in the 1970s school of thought where you can be a movie about an awful person, sometimes by juxtaposing it against a somehow worse person or even a much worsening law enforcement system. And the movie's also something of a scathing critique on the media, which I think is very analogous to what we always deal with as a culture, especially today's sensationalist time. It's very timely. Even though the movie is about 15 years old, I think it plays just as timeless today. I think this is something of a very underseen classic. And I shamefully am one of the many people who did not know this movie existed, but I'm thankful that it does in my life. And I'm going to spend the rest of my my days singing the gospel of this film. I think it's awesome.
That's great. I love that. I'm so glad that you enjoyed it. Very terrified at certain points when I was rewatching this. I also wanted to mention really quickly just how smart some of the decisions are that the director makes, because in the opening part where what turns out to be a killer is walking with this lady, she's parked and he makes fun of her parallel parking. And then she says, it doesn't matter, I won't be here long. And then it cuts to that's the only car there the next day. And as the audience member, you're like, this is bad. And then the shot stays on the car and you just notice as more and more flyers are appearing on the car and tickets for staying there. And it's just like the way that he shows the passing of time so economically is just so smart. I absolutely love it. It's the first moment where I was like, ooh, we're in good hands. I like this. Yeah, I think that this is it's just so good. The use of score that they use also, where it's just string instruments and percussion, keeps it away from putting it any sort of specific 2008 vibe. It's also
That's true.
So gray, and the cars aren't like new or old. So when you said timeless, I was like, that is one of the things I really like about this movie, is that if you went back to the 70s and showed this, aside from the violence, people would be like, yeah, this was made now.
In flip phones.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many flip phones in this movie. But you show it to people now, and outside of the technology of the phone, it's like, yeah, this works. Like, this just can exist in its bubble. But yeah. Well, Preston, thank you so much for watching The Chaser and joining me to record today.
Thank you for having me once again. It's always a pleasure, Dirk. And if you ever want me again, you know where to find me.
Absolutely, and I will. And where can people find you one more time?
Sure. If you don't follow me already, please follow me on Twitter at PRESTOMIT. I'm always tweeting away about things I'm currently watching, things I have watched. I try to keep the feed positive as much as we can and flip it. I don't take myself too seriously. In contrast to maybe the movies I might gravitate to the most, that is, I try to be a pretty tongue-in-cheek individual. But you can also find me on Letterboxd at PRESTO_MITCH. I love writing little reviews at times of what I watch. And I love connecting with people on there as well.
Fantastic. And as always, I'm Dirk Marshall, and this has been VHS Presents New Releases and Late Returns.